In 1960, these are the per capita incomes in Burundi, Haiti, and Nicaragua. Despite Nicaragua's sevenfold difference in income, it is still poor by developed country standards. Fast forward to 2010, per capita incomes were basically unchanged, showing negligible growth over that half-century. One possible explanation for the unchanging income was the poverty trap. The poverty trap is caused by a self-reinforcing mechanism that causes poverty. People that are trapped in poverty have limited or no resources, making it virtually impossible to break the cycle unless there's outside intervention. The lack of resources may increase their poverty, and they may remain poor throughout their lives. That is why at the national level, countries that start poor would remain poor. Some believe that a country will remain poor if it can accumulate sufficient capital per capita for incomes to rise. At the individual level, even in a developed country like Canada, the cycle is almost impossible to break, and you can see trends like people dropping out of school, working minimum wage jobs, and living high-risk lifestyles. At the beginning of 2020, 588 million people were in extreme poverty, 7.7% of the world population with an income below $1.9 per day. A lot of governments and non-governmental bodies try to reduce poverty, but these efforts can be sabotaged by corruption, tax avoidance, debt, and brain drain. The aid usually comes in the form of welfare, economic freedom, and financial services. However, the poorest in the middle-income countries usually don't get the benefits of the increased wealth of their countries. The model of poverty traps at the country level implies that countries will have stagnant income levels for a long period of time. Similarly, the same can be found at the individual level. People who are rich have different outcomes, while people who are poor stay the same. But it is possible to see low incomes at the country level, but considerable incomes at the individual level, and vice versa. In early Victorian Britain, most authorities agree that poverty was not a social problem, but an inevitable consequence of wage labor and the natural laws of economics. So it's not something that can be fixed. It is a natural order. So people that had no income can apply for public relief from poor law authorities and were given the legal status of paupers. This was frowned upon, since it was seen as voluntary to make oneself destitute. But the long depression during the 1880s wears away the simple distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. Increasing competition from other industrialized nations like Germany and the US prompted interest in the poor, since economic rivalry demands a productive workforce, and the poor were seen as a threat to the national economy. Besides, Britain faced a lot of shortages of able-bodied and fit recruits for the Boer War. This results in a mass citizenship, since there was a fusion in political economy and social Darwinism, which sees society as not equal, that some people are more powerful than the others, and people are more accepting that the poor are poor, contrasting the earlier atomistic view of society that sees individual as rational, equal, and self-interested, since they can be blamed for not succeeding. It was arguably this and the conflict of the first half of the 20th century that leads to the formation of the British welfare state. Whether it was their fault or not, there are many causes of poverty. According to the World Health Organization, malnutrition is the biggest threat to the world's public health, and it is the biggest factor for child mortality. People in poverty are more likely to get sick or be disabled. Not only that, poverty impedes cognitive function, and they would need a lot of mental resources to cope with their financial burden. Toxins from the bad living environment and stress affecting parenting behavior can further weigh the children and parents. The poor spend a lot of their income on food, so they are vulnerable to food price changes. In 2007, increased grain prices led to riots in some countries. These are usually caused by drought or water crisis. Intensive farming can lead to soil degradation. It is estimated that around 20% to 40% of the world's agriculture is seriously degraded. In Africa, if the current trend is going, it can only feed 25% of its population by 2025. In 2019, it is estimated that 5.2 million children die before the age of 5. Those that survive and are exposed to poverty have a slow cognitive development. This is evident since children with better nourishment adopt speaking language at a younger age. Economic conditions also cause poverty. Conditions like low GDP, not enough wealth to escape poverty as a nation, and a high unemployment rate. But it is also perpetuated by many factors, like poor health and education, not enough capital, and sudden life changes. Programs by the government and private philanthropies often fail to move people out of poverty, since they often treat them like band-aids that cause dependency with no long-term solution. They, however, address the symptoms and provide access to necessities. But while it is easier to endure poverty, it doesn't make it any easier to escape them. In order to escape, something that they must be given sufficient aid to acquire the critical mass of capital to get out of poverty. In this book, The End of Poverty, Economic Possibilities for Our Time, Jeffrey Sachs postulates that the public sector should concentrate its effort on investment in these capitals. One of the reasons why some people keep on being dependent is that they don't reach the critical mass of capital to escape poverty. Health is arguably one of the most important factors causing poverty. Countries with poor health conditions tend to be mired in poverty compared to other countries, even when they have similar educational attainment. A study from the University of Gainesville shows that areas with limited human, animal, and crop disease were able to lift themselves out of poverty, while people in areas with rampant diseases with no way to combat it were not. People are often stuck in poverty there, no matter how much economic aid they receive. Poor people depend on physical labor to get income, so infectious diseases would prevent them from working, since they wouldn't be able to depend on their physical strength to work. However, there are things that can be done. Structural changes are an interesting way to break the poverty trap, such as giving increased access to healthcare and vaccination. Rwanda, a country wrecked by genocide and civil war, is held up as an example of a nation that tackled the poverty trap by addressing factors beyond income. They focused on healthcare and insurance to increase the daily calorie intake. In spite of that, some researchers think that the government reduced the measurement threshold that measures poverty to look successful. But I don't know. Governments should enact policies that don't support the wealthy at the expense of the poor. But I guess you can see that they do the exact opposite. When governments fail to enforce labor standards or roll back policies that prevent deforestation or pollution, they're contributing to the loss of livelihood and a healthy environment for people. Governments also fail to invest in resources that can ensure people to get what they need, like excluding certain children from attending schools in certain countries. In Tanzania, there were policies that prevent pregnant girls from attending schools, and the former president endorsed that. I mean, this is the same person that endorsed prayers and herbal-infused steam therapy to combat the coronavirus. Some poverty is temporary if you look at the national level. For instance, recession, natural disasters, and anthropogenic disasters. But at the individual level, it can be quite different. There are events that push people into poverty that are hard to escape, like loss of jobs or family-owned business, death of family members, or incarceration. Once poor, people can experience difficulty escaping poverty because many things that would allow them to do so require money they don't have. Like if you have no skills, you need money for education and retraining with new skills, or to migrate to a new place with better economic opportunities, or to cure disease, especially in countries that don't have free healthcare. While it might sound weird, or maybe it doesn't, being poor sometimes costs a lot more money than being rich. I mean, obviously the rich spend a lot more money, but they spend more on luxury rather than necessities. They spend a lot less on their necessities than the poor. For example, not being able to buy a refrigerator would cost more since buying in bulk is cheaper, but the poor are not capable of this. Most of them don't understand banking, and while many of them have to stay far from work to save money, since it is cheaper to live outside cities, they lose time. They lose the period crucial for personal development to further diversify the prospect of other work. So what about education? Isn't it seen as the ticket to move out of poverty? To break the vicious cycle? I guess, yeah. It is seen as one of the best ways that can help people to move out of poverty. I mean, people can just move to an affluent neighborhood and expect themselves to be rich, since being rich is the consequence of social mobility, not the cause. So many people see education as the only way to enter the labor market and gain economic benefits. It is seen as a significant role to give people opportunities. While many people acknowledge this, it is not that simple, and we see little evidence of this. By the age of 8, There are already large gaps in the performance of school children between the top 20% of the population and 80% of the bottom quintiles in South Africa. By an early age, children already have different prospects from affluent and poor communities. In Latin American countries, receptive language among 3 to 6-year-olds vary widely by wealth. This shows the systematic evidence that gaps in child development outcomes appear early in the life cycle. Parents' level of education is a strong predictor of children's educational and economic outcomes. The language skills of 3-year-olds increased as their mother furthered their education. They also have healthier babies. Babies born to mothers with low education in the Dominican Republic are 4 times more likely to die than those with higher education. The education system doesn't challenge patterns of poverty and privilege, rather, they reinforce them. So, inequalities in school manifest themselves in the labor market, perpetuating the patterns of inequality. Furthermore, schools that underperform hire the least qualified teachers. For example, teachers that are brought in from the suburbs are more likely to transfer out after their initial year. And usually, students from advantaged backgrounds perform better since the education system favors them. Advantage breeds advantage. Now, let's look at 2006 South Africa. 49% of education spending reached the poorest 40% of households. Even so, staff spending represents 80% of the education budget. This limits the degree to which education spending can be reallocated. Teacher salaries are based on their experience and qualifications, so better qualified teachers often teach more affluent schools. Schools of the poor receive 6 times higher spending than the affluent schools. Despite this, the affluent communities are still well sourced due to the practice of charging school fees. So the quality of the poor remains disappointing, and the cognitive achievement of South African children in reading, mathematics, and science are low. The schools are also highly unequal due to the scars and legacy of apartheid. Former black schools and former white schools still have the performance gap and students from different socioeconomic statuses. Students can see schools as a way out of poverty since they lack discipline, have weak management, and hire less qualified and experienced teachers. The influence of parents, peers, and the neighborhood effect reinforce the relationship between poverty and low-quality schools. The children's socioeconomic background matters less for their performance than the place they live in and the school they attend. Teacher quality and teacher knowledge are thought to be crucial to learner performance, and the results show that insufficient teacher knowledge is the problem in most schools in Africa. The average teacher scores in reading and mathematics were well below full marks, but teacher knowledge made little difference to learner performance. A 100-point improvement in teacher performance was accompanied by an average 7-point increase in learner scores. But this doesn't mean the quality of teachers is unimportant. It may mean that it depends on the teacher's way to convey knowledge to their students, or it also may mean that some schools impede teachers' impact on the students because of the bad school condition. So, what are the factors that influence good educational outcomes? Well, some studies show that giving access to textbooks gives good educational outcomes. When learners have their own textbooks or share with no more than one other person, they tend to perform better, though the effect isn't seen in mathematics. School discipline and effective management make a large difference to performance. Things like curriculum planning for a full year, a functional timetable, good teaching support material, good quality inventories, and low teacher absenteeism. Poor feedback from students can hinder progress as well. Like, to suggest students from poor backgrounds to take mathematical literacy than mathematics is contentious. Some people would have been better advised to take the subjects that suit them. The inappropriate subject choice may originate from inaccurate feedback, and it can be detrimental for the students. What's more, managerial efficiency is crucial since additional resources do not lead to improvements in less functional schools. In contrast, efficient schools are able to make the most of whatever resources they are given. So we know that both teacher quality and knowledge should be improved. But while knowledge has a small impact, quality in the way they convey the subjects is important for students' performance. So, after all, education really is important. Leaving school early or receiving low-quality education really can hinder your progress from getting lucrative employment. Income inequality in Africa is not only driven by the differences in the year of education attained, but to a large degree by the quality thereof. Personal choices and cultural influences can also make it difficult to escape poverty, such as choosing not to pursue education and skills that could be used to obtain a high-paying job, or having low expectations for academic and economic success that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. According to the Brookings Institution, people who follow all three of the following steps end up with a poverty rate of only 2%, whereas people who follow none of the steps end up with a poverty rate of 76%. Some people think that poverty is desirable, usually to achieve spiritual or certain religious or moral states, like in Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, as they would abstain from sensual pleasures of the world. This notion led some people to believe that the poor have their own culture that traps them. For instance, time is treated differently by the poor. They don't plan ahead and they don't save money. Children learn helplessness from parents, leading to habits like spending money immediately. Still, getting out of poverty is not as simple as just earning money and moving into a higher class, but giving up certain relationships in exchange for achievement. Nonetheless, this concept is criticized for creating a distorted characterization of the poor, and the theory is kind of untestable. Max Weber suggested that cultural values could affect economic success, but evidence shows that values are not that ingrained in people's lives, since changing economic opportunities are the ones that move people out of poverty, not the change in values. Philip Alston says that caricatures that say the rich are industrious and the poor are losers and scammers are inaccurate, since those people can't choose their life, they're mostly born into one. Many women became victims of trafficking, mostly from prostitution. In Zimbabwe, women are turning to sex to get money for food. Why would people choose to suffer and have that kind of life if they can have a better one? The culture of poverty states that people have intrinsic value that makes them poor despite the anti-poverty program. It received academic criticism but still managed to make a comeback in the 21st century. Small, Harding, and Lamont believe that human action is constrained and enabled by the value we put into our actions. So they think it is important to include this dynamic in the study of poverty. Some scholars think they don't have different values though. Lewis argued that the burdens of poverty were systemic, and it led to the formation of an autonomous subculture as children acquired the behavior that perpetuate their inability to escape the underclass. Lewis gave 70 characteristics of the culture, though he said it wasn't shared among all of the lower class. He said that the people of the culture feel helpless, dependent, and inferior. These people have very little sense of history. They only know their own troubles. They don't have the ideology or the vision to see the similarities between them and others like them in other parts of the world. They're not class conscious, though they are very sensitive to status distinctions. To Lewis, when they adapt internationalist view or became class conscious, they are no longer part of the culture. Since the 1960s, critics call the theory fatalistic, since it doesn't describe the poor so much as it serves the interests of the rich. Carol Stack, a critic, cited Highland Lewis, another critic, arguing that the theory makes us believe that raising the income of the poor would not change their styles or values, but it's like funneling money into a bottomless, self-destructing pit. In other words, the theory makes us believe that no matter how much money you give them, they would still be poor because of their values. That is why the theory is so fatalistic. She illustrated how the political interest to keep the wages low would make it convenient for people to buy into the culture of poverty. In sociology and anthropology, it created a backlash, and scholars are looking into the structures for the problem rather than blaming the victim. Since the 1990s, the concept came back, but scholars rejected the unchanging idea of poverty. The two different arguments as to why poverty exists have very different policy implications. So the two arguments, which are the poverty culture and the poverty trap, have to be tested. For the poverty culture, it says that if we give them a lot of money, they would still return to their state of being poor because they are intrinsically poor. However, the poverty trap argument says that the money given will permanently move them to higher wealth, but the size of the money cannot be too high that they would be lifted out of poverty entirely, and cannot be too low that they can't meet the certain threshold to escape poverty. So they have to give them just the right amount. So they found that in some circumstances, a one-off transfer will enable people to get out of poverty through their own agency, and this aid can be given in other forms other than money, like training and human capital. This finding may indicate that poverty culture doesn't exist, and newer research rejects the idea that the poor can be explained by their values. In the developing world, many factors can contribute to a poverty trap, from limited access to credit and capital markets to war and poor infrastructure. If you look really closely, other forms of poverty traps really look like a cycle, like subsistence trap in which farmers wait for middlemen before they specialize, but middlemen wait for a region to specialize first, or workers wait for jobs using special skills, but firms wait for workers to get such skills. Isolation reduces the number of available technologies. This is defined as a geographic poverty trap. It happens when the characteristics of geography affect household consumption over time, while an identical household living in a different, better endowed area would enjoy a rising standard of living. They used farm household data from China, and they found evidence that living in poor areas lowers productivity because of few rural roads and insufficient geographic capital. But why don't people move out? In China, the hukou system prevents them from getting social services if they move out of their area of registration. Another reason is cost. In Bangladesh, people close to subsistence are not willing to move out, but they would be more willing if they are insured against the risk. But concerns about congestion and the development of urban slums often make policymakers reluctant to encourage internal migration in low-income countries. Sometimes, it depends on your country of residence. Using a visa lottery, Tongan workers experienced a 263% increase in their income within a few months of migrating to New Zealand. A male worker with 9 years of education would earn 7.8 times more working in the US as in Haiti. Prejudice is a big factor, like age discrimination, stereotypes, gender, race, and caste. Women are the group suffering the most after children. Most causes of poverty are systemic. People living in poverty with mental illness felt like the wellness care, housing, and jobs were lacking. They have problems accessing quality services, and the bureaucratic system is bad at helping people since it seems to be devoid of logic. But in some countries, the government themselves are the problem. From 1950 to 1990, South Africa, for example, the government would displace black and colored people into separate neighborhoods, and with that, they control wealth by race. But now, after rebuilding their constitution that they say would acknowledge human dignity and the advancement of human rights and freedom, there are still major inequalities due to the cycle of poverty. For example, the black household income has increased by 169% in the past 10 years, but the white household makes 6 times its black counterpart. For this reason, educating poor children may work in theory, but it is not enough. President Cyril Ramaphosa addressed the issue, but did not provide sufficient remedies. Many kids have access to education, but to further continue, they need resources that their families don't have, forcing them to get minimum wage jobs, and their circumstances of not having proper nutrition can impair cognitive development. Back in the days, divide and conquer turned to apartheid and it became law, since they were confined to specific neighborhoods, and if they so much try as to protest the oppression, the government could target their area without affecting the whites. They also prevent different races from associating. It gave power to the government to control what the people thought of each other, and it is a powerful asset to degrade an entire race of people. The cruel and sickening system was put to a stop by Nelson Mandela, stating that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. It gave those who were born of color a chance to live life, not predetermined paths forced by the government. However, without oppression, the cycle is too vicious to get out of, and generation after generation, they find no way out. Even though apartheid is no longer exist, it left a deep scar, a scar that would take longer than 20 plus years to fade. Now, my favorite part. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu described 3 types of capital that places people in certain social categories: economic capital, social capital, and cultural capital. Economic capital is cash and credit. Social capital is group membership, networks of influence and relationships, and support from other people. And lastly, cultural capital is what gives people higher status in society, like education, skills, and knowledge. People with all 3 capitals have a high status in society. Bourdieu found that the upper class is oriented toward formal reasoning and abstract thought, and the lower class is more inclined towards the matter of facts and necessities of life. He found that the environment a person develops in has a large effect on the cultural resources that the person will have. On one hand, it is shown that students raised in a concerted cultivation approach have an emerging sense of entitlement, leading them to ask more questions to the teachers. On the other hand, working-class families used a natural growth approach. They don't focus on developing talents, and they speak to their children in directives. These children are less likely to speak in the classroom and interact with teachers. In the US, links of underperformance in schools with cultural capital and social resources have been made, but it has a lot of inconsistencies even after controlling the factors such as SAT scores and family socioeconomic status. African Americans and Latinos continue to underperform relative to white and Asian counterparts. The theory of capital deficiency is the most recognized explanation, but aside from social, economic, and cultural capital, human capital is one of the largest factors. Human capital refers to skills, abilities, and knowledge possessed by specific individuals. College-educated parents with a lot of human capital can invest in their children by reading to them at night, which can maximize the future success that can give them a better understanding of the school system and to be less deferential to school authorities and teachers. Wilkinson and Pickett analyzed social mobility in developed countries. They found a relationship between high social inequality and low social mobility. In the 8 countries studied, the US had both the highest economic inequality and lowest economic mobility. Some researchers believe that social mobility in America is declining, and a German study confirms the result. Despite the low mobility, Americans had the highest belief in meritocracy among middle and high-income countries. A study of social mobility among the French corporate class found that those in the top tend to dominate despite an emphasis on meritocracy. Education is a strong predictor of social mobility. In spite of that, the quality of education depends on the social class the person is in. Inequality in education makes it harder for people with low income to achieve social mobility. What makes it worse is the accumulation of wealth by dispossession by the rich. It is a neoliberal capitalist policy that concentrates the wealth and power in the hands of the powerful few by dispossessing the public and private entities of their wealth and land. It is most visible in the Western nations from the 1970s to today. Privatization is among the most criticized aspects of neoliberalism. They take the property of public ownership to private ownership, serving the capitalist class, and they use it to generate profit from the public. That is quite disgusting if you think about it. I mean, we're like objects for them to exploit. The powerful can create and manipulate crises. Poorer nations can be forced into bankruptcy, and this can be authorized by parties like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The government sometimes can be blamed for causing poverty. In the UK, a poorly designed algorithm to calculate people's welfare benefits created payment delays and fluctuations that forced people into hunger, debt, and poverty. Algorithms now decide which kids get foster care, which patients to receive treatment, and which families to get stable housing. This created traps for low-income individuals. Fortunately, a growing group of civil lawyers is using playbooks from the criminal defense world's pushback against risk assessment algorithms. They're developing litigation strategies to help the victims, since governments are increasingly adopting algorithms in their systems. But it is understandable. During the pandemic, a massive volume of new requests may have paralyzed the system. So the algorithm can help since it gives faster and more reliable results. However, there are downsides to this. The purchasing of the software is rarely transparent and it lacks accountability. For instance, public agencies buy from private vendors, and the lack of public examination and evaluation makes the system prone to errors. In 2013, the algorithm incorrectly flagged over 34,000 people for fraud in Michigan. It caused a massive loss of benefits. There were bankruptcies, and unfortunately, there were even suicides. The pandemic made it clear how vulnerable people are coping with it. In Cambodia, many low-wage workers lost their jobs. People were forced to turn to microloans, but the providers were unethically coercing people into selling their houses and land when they can't pay back their loans. And the sad thing is, the government isn't doing much to help them. So those are the causes of poverty. However, while many of these studies are done separately, in reality, the world is much more complicated, and many of these studies are done in isolation without interacting with other factors. It is plausible that these trap-like forces play simultaneously at the individual and country level. In my next video, I will talk about ways to combat poverty and how a country, according to some people, miraculously lifted its people out of poverty. And also, I will talk about Africa, because a video about poverty is not complete without mentioning Africa, right? Yeah, just kidding. But I will still talk about Africa because I was wondering, why are they so poor? So yeah, till next time. Bye.